and welcome to the Convex Conversation with me, broadcaster Helen Foss-Barrow. I was lucky enough to have a behind-the-scenes tour of the Neurodegenerative Diseases Brain Bank recently at King's College in London and gain a fascinating insight into some of the groundbreaking research which is helping transform our understanding of dementia. Dementia has become a major health challenge. If nothing changes, half of us could be affected by dementia in some way, either facing it ourselves, caring for a loved one, or both. The brain is, of course, incredibly complex, which has made finding answers difficult. But thanks to important scientific breakthroughs, things are changing, and today's guest is at the cutting edge of that change. I'm at the Dementia Research Centre at UCL Queen's Square Institute of Neurology to meet Professor of Neurology Jonathan Schott. John is also Chief Medical Officer for the charity Alzheimer's Research UK, and I've been assured can make what is a very complicated issue understandable. John, thanks very much for having me here today at the Institute, a place which has many, many big brains like yours inside. Can you rise to that challenge and give us a real understanding of what's going on?
Well, thank you very much for the very generous introduction, for being here, and I will certainly do my best.
Many of us know someone or have a family member with Alzheimer's or dementia. Even though I've been quite involved in listening to some of the research, I get confused too. What is the difference between the two?
So dementia is a real catch-all term, and it basically means that somebody has got acquired, so it hasn't been present all their life. It's progressive, so it's getting worse over time, and it's affecting cognitive function. And technically speaking, for someone to be demented, it means that these changes are affecting their normal activities of daily living. So dementia is a syndrome. That's that description of different aspects, but within that syndrome, there are lots of different causes, and those causes can broadly be divided into diseases that affect the blood vessels of the brain, or for various different reasons, and we're beginning to understand some of these in a bit more detail, cause proteins to fold up, to tangle within the brain, and to cause the brain cells to die, and that leads to the symptoms, and those are neurodegenerative diseases. And the commonest neurodegenerative disease is called Alzheimer's disease. So coming to me as a neurologist and saying someone's got dementia is a bit like going to a chest physician and saying someone's got chest pain. Is the chest pain due to a heart attack? Is it due to a pulmonary embolism, or is it due to a cracked rib? And we see people with dementia which may be due to vitamin deficiencies or alcoholism, or to strokes within the brain, or to Alzheimer's, or to Parkinson's disease. So our job is first of all to get the awareness out there that dementia is not part of normal aging. These are diseases of the brain. And then to try and work out what specifically the different causes of dementia are. And we're getting better and better at diagnosing these during life, as I'm sure we'll discuss, particularly Alzheimer's disease, which is the commonest cause of dementia in the UK.
And how widespread is Alzheimer's now? The stat I gave in the introduction is fairly shocking, to think how we'll all be affected by this some way or other.
So we're not far off, unfortunately, having 1 million people in the UK living with dementia. Alzheimer's disease is the commonest cause. Probably around 60-70% of patients have Alzheimer's. It's slightly complicated because you can have Alzheimer's and other causes of dementia as well, and blood vessel damage. So this is a very major health problem. This is the most feared consequence of aging. It's now the #1 killer. And as you said, the fact that we're living older is fabulous. The fact that we've made such advances in helping people survive from strokes and from cancers, from heart attacks, is great, but it means that people are living longer. And age is the biggest single risk factor for dementia and Alzheimer's disease, which is why it's becoming so prevalent. So many people have it, and why, as people live longer, their individual chance of getting Alzheimer's disease is increased, as is their spouse, and why this is such a societal problem.
We often talk about numbers and risk, but ordinary people from all walks of life who come through your door on a Monday morning on your NHS clinic, it's people, isn't it, at the real heart of this?
Absolutely. And one thing that is very sobering about a disease like Alzheimer's is that it doesn't distinguish. In my clinics, I see people who are of all walks of life. I will see people who have arrived as immigrants from other countries who have Alzheimer's disease. I'll see people who are High Court judges who have Alzheimer's disease. This does not distinguish, which is why any efforts that we make to diagnose Alzheimer's disease and to offer treatments can't just be for a privileged few. They really have to be tackling the societal problem as a whole, and that means all people, means elderly people, because that's the most common age group for people to get dementia and Alzheimer's disease, but it's men and women, it's different ethnic groups, different societal groups. This affects everyone. So it's really important that whatever we do it in a democratic way. And whilst often the advances start in august institutions like I have the privilege of working in, what we really need to do is to get it to everybody who might benefit.
I think some people write it off as, that's what you get when you get old. But I've met a lot of people with dementia, and I've met a lot of young people with dementia. It isn't just a disease of age, is it?
Absolutely. So this is complicated because the biggest risk factor for dementia is age, although, as you say, there are a significant proportion of people who do have young onset dementia, which is arbitrarily those with onset below the age of 65. But between 60 and 65, it's about 0.5% of the population, and then it doubles every 5 years, which is why you get to those very high numbers as you get to older ages. So it is a disease associated with old age, but it is not an inevitable cause. And the slight memory problems or naming difficulties that people might complain of as they get older is very different from this insidious destruction of memory or behavior or speech, depending on the different type of dementia that occurs, and that really begins to impact on people's activities of daily living and ultimately leads to dependence and premature death. So these very much need to be considered as diseases, but sometimes, certainly in the early phases, separating these out from the early changes of aging is quite difficult, particularly as we now move to diagnose people earlier and earlier and earlier. And saw someone in my clinic this morning who we've diagnosed as having Alzheimer's disease, but actually is fairly independent, something that maybe we wouldn't have done a few years ago. So we're now more happy to diagnose people using some of our newer tools, which we'll discuss, at a stage when they only have mild memory problems, mild cognitive impairment, to be able to say that that's due to Alzheimer's or not. So it's a real challenge, but no, the core of your question is absolutely correct, which is that these diseases, whilst common as you age, are not part of aging.
We'll talk about some of those new tools and the research you're involved in a moment, but just give us a sense, because you really do see it firsthand, how devastating it is as a disease. People really lose themselves, don't they, in their memories and who they are when they have it in the advanced stages.
Certainly towards the advanced stages, and I think one thing to say is as we diagnose people earlier, often people still can have a very good quality of life and can be reasonably independent, but one of the core features of dementia is that it's progressive. So it does mean that there is change over time, and with the change over time does come a loss and a progression of the symptoms. In Alzheimer's disease, it typically starts with problems with what we call episodic memory. So that's like your own personal diary, what you've done in the last few days, what you'll do. But then it will extend to problems navigating, problems naming. And over time, it does lead to increasing dependence and loss of dignity and premature death. And of course, that's something that is not just borne by the individual who may or may not be variably distressed, but by those around them as well. As I unfortunately say to my patients in clinic and their carers or caregivers or family members, unfortunately, dementia is very much a team sport. Most people live in a family or live with a partner, and this has major effects on the people living with the person with dementia as it does with that individual as well. And sometimes the distress is much more actually in the family member or the caregiver than it is of the patient. So very much we need to take a holistic view of this. But unfortunately, you're absolutely right. These diseases really are devastating. That's why, as we've made the advances in cancer and stroke and people are living longer, this is now the most feared consequence of aging.
So scientifically, I suppose the $6 million question is, where are we and what's been done? Tell me about your work, John, and what you're doing at the moment.
So I think the headline is that we are making huge progress. I've been researching Alzheimer's and related disorders for about 25 years, and it's really been within the last 3 to 4 or 5 years that we've suddenly seen that upswing. And we often say that we're about 15 or 20 years behind cancer, the time that you couldn't say the word cancer, and now we can, and people come forward and we have new treatments and new diagnostics, and everybody knows somebody who's alive today who has been treated and cured from cancer who wouldn't have been alive 20 years ago. And we're very much on the cusp of hopefully making those differences with dementia. So where to start around progress? Well, first and foremost, and I speak as a clinician scientist or a clinical scientist, so my research is all really embedded in people. So I work with very clever scientists who are working on cells in the lab or designing new treatments or looking at the genetics, but I'm actually involved in people and that interface between those laboratories and actually what we can do for individuals. So as a clinician scientist and as a clinician, to me, the starting point is around diagnosis and correctly diagnosing people. So we've touched on some of the difficulties of determining that very early stage between someone aging and developing dementia. And that's even more complicated because we now know through various studies using brain scans and spinal fluid tests and patients who have given their brains after they've died for examination of their brains at post-mortem, so examining what's going on in the brains, that the diseases that cause dementia and Alzheimer's disease particularly start many years before symptoms start. So that's why there's this often real difficulty in blurring the onset of these disorders. But even in people who've got quite established cognitive problems or dementia, if you are diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease without using some of the latest sorts of tests, confirmatory tests, then the diagnosis is wrong in around 30% of cases. As high as that, which means that there are lots of people who have Alzheimer's disease who are never diagnosed, and there are some people who are diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease who don't have Alzheimer's disease. So one of the really critical things is making sure that we get the diagnosis right. The defining features of Alzheimer's disease is this misfolding or this accumulation of clumps of abnormal proteins within the brain. And those clumps of proteins are specifically related to Alzheimer's disease. There are different clumps of proteins that relate to Parkinson's or frontotemporal dementia or various other causes. But in Alzheimer's disease, the key proteins is a protein called amyloid, which accumulates with the brain, and one called tau, T-A-U. And for some time now, we've been able to detect these proteins by doing a lumbar puncture test. Taking some spinal fluid off, and the spinal fluid that bathes the brain, we can use techniques to measure these proteins in the spinal fluid. And for some time now, we have been able to do very specialized brain scans called PET scans when we inject a small dose of a radio tracer. So it's a molecule that gets across from the blood into the brain and actually latches onto the amyloid, and we attach a radio tracer which just for a short period of time gives off a radio signal, and you can actually visualize those amyloid plaques and increasingly the tau tangles within the brain. So that allows us to actually do what we do on what happens at post-mortem, which is to actually examine the brain and show whether or not you have these Alzheimer changes. So we've had these tools available, but there's been problems with these tests, and they're currently only used in 2 to 5% of people diagnosed with Alzheimer's in the UK because the spinal fluid test requires a skilled operator, and you haven't always got the facilities to do those, and the PET scans are expensive and there aren't many PET scanners. So that's been a major problem, but a real breakthrough recently has been blood tests. We now have technology which, due to really extraordinary advances in machinery and technology, means that we can detect the most tiny concentrations of these abnormal proteins that leach from the brain into the blood, something that was real science fiction even 5 years ago. And so we can now start to use a blood test to diagnose Alzheimer's disease. So that's one very major breakthrough.
That's extraordinary. So if you do the blood test and you detect these proteins, are there then drugs or medicine that people can take to help?
So we now have 2 drugs which are licensed for Alzheimer's disease, which can clear the amyloid protein from the brain. Now, there are some cautions and caveats with these, that these drugs are licensed in the United Kingdom, but they're not available on the National Health Service. They're very expensive.
Oh, wow.
We're talking £100,000 a year or thereabouts.
Gosh.
So they are available in the private sector. And we at Alzheimer's Research UK and others are working very hard to try and get some access to these medications. But they're being used in the United States and in many countries around the world. These are not trivial. These drugs involve infusions through a vein every 2 to 4 weeks, and they involve brain scans to monitor, make sure there are some safety concerns. And they have some real effect, as well as clearing the amyloid, on some of the progression of the disease. And there's some questions about the risks and the benefits and the cost effectiveness. But the important thing is that these are the first chink in the armour. This is the first time that we have a proper disease-modifying therapy that is specifically targeting the core features of Alzheimer's. For 20 years or so, we've had drugs that we've used for Alzheimer's. I've prescribed them this morning in my clinic, which boost some of the chemicals, the end stage of the process. But these drugs are now really getting to the core, to the heart of the matter. And this has really spurred a huge resurgence in the field, new approaches to clear these proteins, to show that now we know it's possible. There are many more approaches, and we hope that there will be other drugs coming that can be given under the skin or be given over shorter time periods or will be safer. But we need to start now. We need to really get that infrastructure going so that we diagnose people properly. This is all part of, I think, also breaking down the myth, because something that can be diagnosed with a blood test and something that can respond to a treatment, these are the defining features of a disease. And so this is, again, particularly with several famous people who come forward about their illnesses, again, is taking dementia and Alzheimer's disease out of the shadows, like we saw for cancer all those years ago, or for HIV and AIDS. The idea that these are not some mysterious condition. Yes, they're feared, and yes, they're horrible conditions, but you can put a name to them and you can diagnose them with a blood test and you can start the treatments. And this really, I think, changes the narrative, which is equally important.
You say it's the first chink in the armour. It does sound a very significant first chink. Just curious to know, for the people who are lucky enough, perhaps in America, to be on that drug, is it still seen as, quotes, a cure, or more something that can manage their symptoms and improve their symptoms? Because obviously we'd all love a cure, but that's difficult to find, isn't it?
Yeah, and the risk of getting into semantics, it depends a little bit what one means by a cure.
Yeah.
So the hope is that these changes within the brain occur a decade or more before symptoms start, so that in the future, and there are trials ongoing, elderly people who have, say, a positive blood test or a positive PET or a spinal fluid test who've got the Alzheimer changes within the brain, if you gave the treatment that can clear those proteins from the brain, whether you'll prevent people from ever getting problems. So that's an interesting question, whether it's a cure if you've never had any symptoms, but that's one question. The drugs that we've got look like they probably slow the progression down by about 30%. So I don't think that's a cure, but it's a very significant potential for slowing for some individuals, but not for all. But again, I think this has re-energized the field, and we're not now just looking at amyloid. I think there are 160 or so different drugs in different phases of trials, and about 25% of those are targeting amyloid. And with our understanding through genetics and cellular models and so forth, we've got lots and lots of different ideas about how Alzheimer's starts and lots of other therapeutic targets. So I think there are many, many other approaches. I think that whilst there are some research going on about restoring lost brain cells, if that's what one means by a cure, that really is some way off. But at the moment, I think if we can use symptomatic therapies that we already have, we can begin to use some of these new therapies to slow and ultimately move to a pre-dementia detection and treatment and slowing all the time to or preventing the onset of dementia. That, I think, really is where we're headed to. And I really do think this is a reality within the next 10 years or so.
Where are we in terms of these? I think they're called blood-based biomarkers, aren't they?
That's right, yeah.
What work needs to be done to find something that isn't as expensive and that can be accessed by everybody on the NHS and privately too?
Absolutely. So these blood tests, they are now a reality. So there are several licensed blood tests in the US. And we have taken one of these blood tests and translated it from our research lab into the clinical lab here at the University College London Hospitals at the Institute of Neurology. And that test now can be requested. And we've had well over 1,000 tests that are requested, generally from specialist neurology centres. And the cost of that blood test is pretty reasonable. It's around £100. So we do have a test, and we've shown that it works well, and we've shown that it comes at a reasonable cost. The next piece of work that we're doing, and this is part of something called the Blood Biomarker Challenge, which was funded by Alzheimer's Research UK, the Alzheimer's Society, and the Players of the People's Postcode Lottery and various others, is specifically to see whether we can show that these blood tests can be used for everyone. So as part of the Blood Biomarker Challenge with my colleague, Dr. Ashwini Keshavan here at UCLH and with our clinical trials unit and lots of colleagues around the country, we're actually running a clinical trial, which is called the ADAPT study. And that's basically to introduce this blood test into memory clinics across the country. So we're going to go for 20 memory clinics across the country that don't have access to these specialist PET scans or these spinal fluid tests, who diagnose patients as most people are diagnosed through a clinical assessment, which is still the most important part of the assessment, with maybe a brain scan as well, a CT or an MRI scan. And we are offering everybody who enters this trial the blood test result. But the design of the study is that half of the people will get the blood test result after 3 months and the remainder after a year. And by doing this delayed start design, we can actually determine whether the people who get the earlier results do better. They do better in terms of their quality of life, because actually dealing with uncertainty is very difficult, and actually weathering a definite diagnosis one way or the other is helpful, whether they get onto medications, whether they get into clinical trials, and whether this is cost effective. And so we can compare that 3-month group versus the 12-month group to see whether this confers benefit. And that trial is being done specifically to try and find the evidence that will be needed for the National Institute for Health and Hair Excellence, which is NICE, and that's the government body here in the UK, which basically mandates whether something should be part of routine NHS practice. So that trial's underway. We've got 7 or 8 sites already up and recruiting, and we're hopeful that we will get our 1,100 people in fairly promptly and get the results, because there's a lot of people who are very interested to seeing how that trial performs.
And this must be pretty exciting times for you as somebody who's worked in this field for a long time.
No, it's hugely exciting, and the idea that we might have a blood test was science fiction. If at the end of this we could make this part of routine practice for everyone going to a memory clinic in whom Alzheimer's is suspected, that would be a really, really exciting stage. And it's one part of the puzzle, because in order to make real inroads on this, we need the really clever fundamental science to understand why people get these symptoms, why these proteins build up. We need treatments. We need the blood tests and the infrastructure to be able to deliver these therapies. So it's a real team effort. And I feel very privileged as a clinical scientist that at that interface between the research and seeing the patients, I don't need any reminder of how important this is, doing a clinic each week. But really, whilst there's a danger of being a jack of all trades and a master of none, one can see all of these aspects coming together. And that is really very exciting.
And is having that clinic every week and seeing patients and seeing their families what really drives you forward in your work?
It's critical, and often we have some of our science colleagues come see patients in clinic, and some of our science colleagues are extremely good science communicators and spend time with patients as well, because that's what it's all about. Whilst we're academics, this is not an academic exercise. Some of my colleagues around the square here are very interested in how the normal brain functions, and that's very interesting and hugely relevant, and actually the bedrock of much of what we might do. But I don't consider myself a neuroscientist. I'm a neurologist who does research. I'm really interested in the diseases that cause cognitive problems, cause dementia, and how we can diagnose and treat them. So that's really very much my motivation. And it's not difficult to say motivated when you see the people who are affected by these diseases every week.
How much do we know about what causes these changes in the brain and why dementia and Alzheimer's exist?
So again, I think one needs to hone down from distinguish between dementia and Alzheimer's disease. So like most complex diseases, the vast majority of cases we think are a complex mix between your genetics, so your genetic blueprint, how you're put together, and your exposures in the environment. Different forms of dementia we think have got different sorts of risk profiles. So a very large and important piece of work that's gone on for many years is a big commission, a Lancet commission looking at dementia, which has not looked at specific causes of dementia per se, but looked at all causes of dementia and said, what are the risk factors? And there are around 14 risk factors that operate across the life course that probably account for maybe 40% of someone's risk of getting dementia. And that's everything from how educated you are as a child to whether you smoke, whether you exercise, whether you have diabetes and hearing loss, depression, social activities, blood pressure. So these are some very tangible things that some of them are things that governments need to do, some of them as individuals to maximize your own brain health. But if 40% of all-cause dementia across the world is potentially preventable, it follows that that's probably less in Western countries when lots of these aspects are already being addressed. And therefore, a large amount of this must be in genetics. So if we take Alzheimer's disease, for instance, very rarely, a very small number of people, less than 0.5% of Alzheimer's, are caused by one faulty gene that may run in a family. This often causes young onset Alzheimer's disease that runs through families. But we know that for the more common later onset cause, through huge, great studies, many of which have been coordinated through the UK infrastructure, that there are a large number of genes, maybe 100 genes, which each confer a very small increased risk, but put together may account for 60, 70, 80% of someone's risk for Alzheimer's disease. So it's a matter of trying to marry together those individual risks on a genetic basis with an individual's exposures through life, and as well as this blood test trial. Another major strand of my research is to try and study this intersection by studying a very, very rare and incredible group of individuals who were all born in 1 week in 1946 in this country, the British 1946 birth cohort. And we've been doing some studies over the last 10 years or so, really trying to dive deep into their cognitive function using all of the tests that I've mentioned, brain scans and spinal fluid tests and memory tests and so forth, to try and really unpack what causes someone's risk, both on a genetic basis and on what they've been exposed to during their life, which has been recorded in unprecedented detail since they were born.
That's Insight 46,
That's
isn't
right,
it?
yeah.
How does it work? And that's fascinating that you've got a group of people born the same week and now getting a little bit older, of course.
So this is a really extraordinary study. So, and by way of brief background, so after the Second World War, there was a real concern that there would be falling birth rates because of people who'd been killed during the war, and whether the UK was going to be able to sustain itself, particularly around agriculture and working people. And so the government did a maternity survey when they went out and interviewed every mother born in 1 week in 1946 about their experiences in life giving birth. And this uncovered that only 1 in 3 women had had any form of pain relief during childbirth, which led to a law change, disproportionate costs of raising children for working class people. And so this was an important study in its own right. But then the government decided that they would follow 5,362 of these babies who've now been followed through 26 different waves of collection throughout their lives. So we know how much they weighed when they were born, and we know when they walked and talked, and we know how they did at school and their cognitive performance from the age of 8, and then what they did from employment where they've lived. So you can map the pollution that they were exposed to. We know their blood pressure from their late 30s. We know when the women had their menopause. We know about their bone health. And then around 10 or 11 years ago, we started this study called Insight 46 to really delve in huge detail by taking initially 502 individuals and now another 300 more from all the way around mainland Britain, bringing them here down to London in UCL, and then coming for 1 and now up to 3-day visits when they have brain scans, and we assess their memory and thinking. About a third of them have had a lumbar puncture. We looked at their vision and their hearing and sense of smell and their walking. Then they've had heart scans, and they've had bone scans and eye scans. Remarkable, these individuals who give up their time for research and this project, and they've just turned 80. And so unfortunately, we're seeing some people who are dying or some people who are getting dementia. But we've also been able to use all of these tests to show, for instance, that at the age of 70, 20% of them have got a brain scan that looks just like Alzheimer's disease. And those people are at higher risk of developing problems in the last 10 years or so, but by no means everyone. So this is really helping inform this idea about, can we predict who is going to get dementia, Alzheimer's disease, so we can offer treatments. We can also go back earlier in the life course and show that people's blood pressures from their 30s and onwards is quite important for their brain health in their late 70s. And we can look at the effects of childhood cognition, and we can show that exercise throughout the life course has beneficial effects on cognition. So there's been over 50 papers, and this is from funding initially from Alzheimer's Research UK and from Medical Research Council and the Wilson Foundation, and latterly by the Alzheimer's Association in the US, who've been funding this work. And I'm pleased to report that we're about to start our next studies, which is continuing this work, but also moving into the next 2 birth cohorts, which are the 1958 and the 1970 cohorts, also all the way around Britain, but led here from UCL, to see whether some of the findings that we've got in the 46 cohort are borne out in the subsequent cohorts who were born at different times since then.
What do you then do with the learnings that you get from these groups?
First of all is clearly to publish them, make sure that they're accessible to the scientific community. A lot of this is fed back, and particularly ARUK is very helpful with this in terms of policy and policy changes, trying to influence what we do in terms of the policy agenda. When do you check your blood pressure during life? What do we need to do about atmospheric pollution? The field of dementia is very collegiate and collaborative. So we share our data and contribute to very large efforts going on around the world with our colleagues in Europe and the States and Australia and other countries as well, because we can answer some really important questions with a few hundred people, but sometimes you need different magnitudes of scale. The genetics studies now extend into the hundreds of thousands of cases, so we contribute to all of those. So, yeah, we do our own research here. We train the next generation of researchers. We've had more PhDs than I can count coming from the studies. We try and advance ideas and scientific publications, collaborate and influence the public agenda and public perception as well. So that's why it's so nice to talk to you today and hopefully get the word out more generally.
Well, it sounds fascinating work. The tour of the brain bank for me was absolutely enlightening. And if I'm honest with you, John, I thought we might see a few slides and people had kindly given their brain to research once they'd passed away. I was quite taken aback when a young researcher actually lifted half a brain out of a tub. And honestly, once you're over the shock of actually that is a brain, it just was extraordinary to think that the brain is so complex and responsible for our thoughts, our imagination, who we are. And it really brought it home to me, I think, the work that you're all doing. So there's work after life, isn't there, if people are able to donate their brain for scientific purposes?
Absolutely. These neurodegenerative diseases or these cerebrovascular diseases are related to different pathologies within the brain, whether it's the tangling up of the proteins or it's the changes in the blood vessels. Whilst we have now sophisticated ways, call them biomarkers, whether that's the blood test or the spinal fluid or the scans of detecting these, the ultimate arbiter is what the pathologist sees, both looking at the brain like you did, or looking at the brain under a microscope, or doing very, very in-depth, sophisticated tools to understand what's going on now down towards the cellular level. So the people who donate their brains for research, I've donated my brain as well, hopefully not for some time, for research. These are the ultimate arbiters. And about 1 in 3 of our Insight 46 cohort have assented that we can examine their brain after death as well. And the techniques that we're using in the brain bank, not we, my colleagues are using in the brain bank, as I say, are extraordinarily sophisticated. The human brain is 70 to 80 billion nerve cells connected, each of them by thousands of connections by synapses. So new techniques which are really being able to drill down into the individual genetics of the individual cell and how they're connected. And also what's very exciting in working with colleagues here is new techniques that can almost link what you see down a microscope when someone's died with what we're seeing in patients, which is generating stem cells as well from patients. So these are our patients who will give us a small sample of skin. From that, we can take a specific type of cell, a fibroblast. Our colleagues who are skilled at this can back-translate that into a stem cell and then translate that into a nerve cell, which allows us to actually allow the nerve cells to grow in a dish. So you can actually get living cells from humans. And you can see the differences then between nerve cells from patients with Alzheimer's or different forms of dementias. So that's also a really important link between our patients, our biomarker tests, the ultimate pathology, and a way of studying real human nerve cells in a dish.
I think a lot of people don't necessarily know that you can actually donate your brain. And my mum's 83, nearly 84. When Dad died, he had a little bit of dementia. Not too much, but a little bit of confusion that we think was early onset of dementia. And she said very boldly today, I need to look into this. That's what I would like to do. So I think there needs to be more awareness, perhaps, that is possible, because it's a sensitive subject, isn't it? We've got over the organ donation, but I think the brain feels a little bit different somehow.
It does. And when we talk to our patients, I think we're sensitive to this, but ultimately, that's how we really find out what's going on. Currently, I think there's well over 2,000 brains in the Queen Square Brain Bank here, and there's brain banks across the country. And clearly, we can't handle having enormous numbers, but for particularly people that we see who are very well researched or have specific illnesses. And also, there's a degree of certainty. If someone's died from dementia, we can actually give a report and tell them what the cause was to know for sure. And that's how ultimately all the progress has been made, is being able to correlate what we see in life with what is seen at post-mortem.
Is Alzheimer's a modern-day disease? When did it first exist historically? When was it recognised?
So it was first recognised about 120 years ago by Alois Alzheimer, who in Germany took new stains that were being used in the dye industry, which could highlight these amyloid plaques and these tangles in the human brain. It's a very, very interesting question. If you go back into antiquity, there are, of course, reports of people having dementia and memory type problems. But it's an interesting question whether this is a modern disease. So the disease itself is not modern, but of course it's emerged as a health problem in more recent times because people are living longer. And the exemplar of this is in developing countries. So as countries get better at controlling infectious diseases and cerebrovascular diseases, they too are seeing dementia coming forward as a major cause, all the different causes of dementia. So in sub-Saharan Africa, there are cases of dementia, but they're likely to be due to HIV or other infectious diseases. But as there's better control of those diseases, people live longer, then they're getting the Alzheimer's disease as a cause of their dementia that we're seeing now. So I think they are a modern reflection of the increased life expectancy rather than it being a new disease. But there's certainly the epidemic nature of Alzheimer's now is in many ways a modern phenomenon, which is due to the success of health initiatives and public health over the last 100 years.
You were talking about 1946 there. I mean, life in 1946 was very different to life in 2026. Do you also look at things like people's phone use and Bluetooth use? We are living in a very different world technologically. I wander around and see people on their phones all the time or the Bluetooth headphones in. Is research going on into that as well, and whether there's any correlation with our brain health and our use of tech?
So I think brain health, for starters, is a very broad topic.
Yeah.
So I think clearly, as we all know, there's concerns about mental health problems in terms of social media use, etc. In terms of dementia, it's complicated because whilst more elderly people use a lot of technology increasingly, it's mainly, I guess, younger people who are using those, so we don't know quite what the impact of that's going to have. There are some very interesting uses of technology in terms of, say, understanding dementia or dementia diagnosis. So all our 1946 participants do remote cognitive testing using a computer. So we can now get to people more remotely doing that. We can have accelerometers and wrist-related technologies to understand movement and sleep. And there are some research studies going on looking at, say, mobile phone use. And actually, for example, whether that changes when people in the early stages of dementia, whether people use it less or have more difficulties in picking up the technology. In terms of cause and effect, I think it's a bit early days because we need the longer term follow-up and for people to get older to see what happens. But there's certainly a lot of interest. And what you highlight is one of the reasons we're so excited to move from the 46 to the 58 to the 1970 cohorts is to be able to assess what we call these secular effects. So in 1946, individuals were born in time of rationing, which went through to the early 50s. So actually, probably from a diet perspective, the UK population has never been healthier. The converse to that was before the Clean Air Act, and there was smog and atmospheric pollution, and smoking was much more prevalent. There were far fewer women, for example, going on to universities. So that was by the 58, things have changed. There's no longer rationing. And then you're beginning to see more of a rise of obesity. And then in the 70 cohorts, which is a bit too close to home in my own age.
Me too.
But in our own lifetimes, then we've seen smoking bans in public places. But then we've seen social media use and an ever-increasing rise of obesity. So in many ways, we need to do this really rich phenotyping, which is the description of how people are and their epidemiology, what they've been exposed to. But we need to do comparative studies, which can either be comparative comparative studies across different countries, but ideally during different epochs, different time scales, to be able to really unpick some of these more subtle changes. And some of my colleagues, and I'm privileged to work with some world-class epidemiologists, and epidemiology is all around the study of these exposures and how they manifest. There are some very sophisticated ways of trying to model, to distinguish between whether things are correlated or whether they are causal. So in other words, whether they happen to occur at the same time or actually one leads to another. And often these are taking into account some of these different cohorts and different effects over time to try and tease out what is cause and what's effect.
It's like putting together a multi-million piece jigsaw.
It is. And on one level, in the brain, it's a billions or trillions of piece of jigsaw. So I think one of the challenges here is sometimes we need to concentrate on the very micro, the tiny, and then we need to take a step back, and as we've done, and show that it's your blood pressure between your 36 and 50 that matters. And then the question is, can we get some very simple health messages, which means that we start regularly checking people's blood pressure. And again, coming back to this idea that we need to do this in an equitable fashion, in that there's a slight danger here that well-educated people who are going to get better and better health, we need to take everyone with us. So it's about not just blood pressure control for people who are regularly going to their doctors, it's the people who don't go to their doctors or don't have English as a first language to make sure the information is accessible to them. We need to think about the food that we consume, which of course a lot of the low quality, high sugar foods are some of the cheapest. How can we make those sorts of changes? So if we're really going to make inroads on this, we need new blood tests and we need new therapies. We also really need global and widespread public health initiatives so that we can do the most good for the most people.
And of course, all of those things that you've talked about, things like food and things like that, help with all sorts of other diseases as well. It all feeds into a much better lifestyle and aging better, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And on one level, it's a problem because we look at our 14 risk factors we know for and we go, well, we've known most of those for a long time. I think this is a huge advantage. I want to prevent dementia, but I also would like to prevent cancer and I'd like to prevent heart disease. And if going for a run makes you feel better, improves your mental health and reduces your dementia risk and reduces your blood pressure and your cholesterol and your stroke risk as well and stops obesity that might also impact on your cancer risk, brilliant. The fact that we have this mantra of what's good for your heart is good for your brain is even more reason, and rather than dividing these into two areas, to combining them and saying, actually, this is a really good thing to be doing for your general health, I think is very powerful.
When you were young, you are young, but I mean, when you were young in terms of just digging yourself into a massive hole. By the way, I really enjoyed the 70s music too. So we're the same age kind of ballpark. But when you were a young student, what was it that led you down this particular research path?
Well, like so many people who go out research, it was really completely serendipitous by chance. Yeah, I was actually at the time interested in researching muscle and nerve disease, and I came down here to Queen Square to see some tests being done, and I bumped into a colleague who said, oh, you should come and see what's going on at the Dementia Research Centre. And I went and I learnt more and then saw the brain scans and suddenly was hooked. And then I did my research here on MRI scans in Alzheimer's disease, and that was my starting point. So lucky start. And then since then, of course, the more you know, the more you're interested you get. And of course, like everybody else, I now know friends and relatives who are getting these diseases, which just then gives me even more personal impetus to continue researching them.
Can we help our own brain health? What kind of things? I mean, obviously you talked about exercise there and things that perhaps you do, but what things can we do? Is it important to stay cognitively sharp and things like that? Can we help reduce our risk of dementia?
So for anyone who's interested, I would suggest they go onto the internet and they type in Think Brain Health, Alzheimer's Research UK, which is a web-based app that is designed for individuals to put in some of their characteristics and get some advice about how they can improve their brain health. And these are quite simple things to start with, and we hope over time we'll get more and more sophisticated. So Absolutely. Keeping yourself sharp is important. To my mind, it doesn't terribly matter what that is. It's so long as you're doing something that interests you. I've gone on record, and I'll go on record again by saying that if you hate Sudoku, then don't start doing Sudoku. So what you want to do is something you find stimulating and interesting, and hopefully will take you in new directions. And as part of that, if you can do something that makes you more connected to others. So that's clearly social connections. Now, some people are more extrovert or introvert than others, but some degree of social connectivity is good. Loneliness is not a great thing for your brain health as well as your well-being. There's all the things that you've alluded to around your heart, around smoking and diabetes and blood pressure. And of course, if there's one thing I'd recommend, it's exercise. If exercise was introduced as a new drug, we'd be talking $1 trillion industry. But again, it doesn't terribly matter, I think, what you do. If you like going running or you like going for walking or swimming, it's getting out and getting your heart rate up several times a week is a good thing to be doing. And you'll probably sleep better, which is probably helpful for your brain health as well.
Sleep's important, isn't it? Good sleep.
Good sleep is important. Sleep is very complicated, and the relationship between sleep and dementia is really very, very complicated, because we know that people's sleep becomes disrupted in the early phases of dementia. We also think that sleep may play a part as well in the development of dementia. But these are really complicated things to tease out. And of course, the worst thing that you can do with your sleep is to get anxious about your sleep, to stop yourself sleeping. But absolutely, so we're often talking about good sleep hygiene, making sure that you're not drinking caffeine after lunchtime-ish, and you're getting some exercise, and you're not drinking too much fluid at night, and eating sensibly. My life was revolutionised by starting wearing eye shades and earplugs, having never been a good sleeper, now sleeping very well. So try all those sorts of things to improve your sleep. Whether or not it's going to affect your dementia risk, it'll also improve your quality of life. We all know how awful it is to feel fatigued during the day, and of course how that can impact your memory as well. So something certainly to think about.
Just looking into a crystal ball, which is, I know, what scientists don't do, but what are your hopes, John, for the next decade?
So my hopes in the short term is that we'll have a blood test that is a routine part of the diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, with the knock-on effects that this will help to define this as a disease rather than, as we discussed, part of aging. It'll improve the quality of the diagnosis, that'll get more people into clinical trials, that we're going to have a next generation of treatments that come, which are going to be faster, better and safer. And I think there's a real prospect for that, maybe the subject of another podcast at some stage. And that ultimately we will move into a stage just like we've had, say, for breast cancer or cervical cancer or for colon cancer, that we will be in a position which we're not at yet. And I ought to say we should not be trying to diagnose people who are at risk of dementia who don't have symptoms. But in due course, if we have everything in place and the drugs that work, that we'd be able to screen everybody, say at the age of 70, reassure most people, track people who are at higher risk, determine when they're within a few years of getting symptoms, and then offer these treatments to prevent the onset of symptoms. And I think that we are actually not far off that. With the blood test for diagnosis, we need to show that the treatments work and are safe and are cost effective. But I do think that's a real prospect for the future. So we would be able to screen, diagnose, treat and prevent at least Alzheimer's disease, which will be a very big inroad, at the same time as really doing all the things that we've spoken about to try and reduce risk, which I think mainly is of the vascular changes within the brain. But even so, that's 30-40% of dementia that will be preventable, would be an absolutely enormous benefit to the individuals who will benefit, but also society, remembering that we spend £40 billion a year looking after people with dementia. That number's going to skyrocket as the numbers go up. So this also becomes a huge drain on resources. So we need really to invest in research now if we're going to prevent those costs from spiralling in generations to come.
Well, thank you so much for having me here at the Institute. It's quite wonderful just wandering around the square and seeing all the signs to the different parts of the neurology department, and just realising how many brilliant people are in places like this doing the work behind the scenes that we don't hear about very often, John. So it's very kind that you've taken some time out today to share what you're doing with us.
It's been a great privilege. Thanks a lot for talking.
You're very welcome. You've been in the company of Jonathan Schott, Professor of Neurology at the UK Dementia Research Centre in London and the Dementia Research Institute, and Chief Medical Officer of Alzheimer's Research UK, hearing about some of the latest research. Download and subscribe to our series at convex.podbean.com, or search The Convex Conversation on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen to yours. I'll be back next week with another great guest. Join me then.